Hello and welcome to the DocArena Podcast in association with Film Ireland. My name is Ross Whitaker, and in this fortnightly podcast series, I talk to filmmakers about their documentaries, both in terms of the subjects they choose and the way in which they fund, craft and distribute their work. In this episode, I'm delighted to speak to Jerry Rothwell, the celebrated director of the new feature documentary, The Reason I Jump. The film is now widely available to watch in cinemas in the UK and Ireland. The Reason I Jump, based on the ideas and text of the book of the same name, is an astonishing film, both because it is incredibly well made and also because it gives an amazing insight into the world of people with autism who are non-verbal. Using an immersive soundscape and stunning cinematography, the film plunges you into the world of non-verbal autism and creates a piece of powerful cinema that I certainly found to be very emotional. It's highly recommended. Here's the trailer for The Reason I Jump.
Can you imagine how your life would be if you couldn't say what you wanted?
Naoki Higashida makes a map of his mind. It's kind of poetry.
How do I see the world? For me, the details jump straight out. Inside my head, there isn't really such a big difference between what I was told just now and what I heard a long time ago. My mind is forever swaying this way and that.
Tried to stop her from being herself.
I think we can change the conversation around autism by being part of the conversation.
Right now, Joss is having a joy that I will never come close to.
To live my life as a human being, nothing is more important than being able to express myself.
Jerry, thanks a million for joining me on the podcast. Just to get started, would you mind describing for people the film and what it's about?
So the film is based on a book by a 12-year-old non-speaking autistic Japanese boy who wrote it by pointing to letters on a letterboard. And in the book, Naoki Higashida, the writer, above all, he kind of evokes a sensory world, a sensory universe of intense sights, sounds, memories, sort of feelings. And that the text of that book is the sort of starting point for the film. When I went to see Naoki, he didn't want to be in the film, didn't want it to be about him, which to begin with felt sort of disastrous, but actually I think was a gift to the film, because what we do with that text is sort of use it as a way of exploring the lives of a number of non-speaking autistic people around the world, and trying to do that with a sort of cinematic equivalent of the book, so in a sensory way, one that immerses you as much as possible in the kind of everyday lives of the five people we meet.
Is that the background to the film then, that you had read this book and it had made you feel like this was something you wanted to make into a film? Because at first glance, the idea of making a film about mostly non-verbal autism sounds like a huge challenge.
Yeah, it's not an area that I was completely unfamiliar with. You know, I started out as a kind of community artist and did a lot of work around using film as an advocacy tool with disabled people, many of whom were autistic or had learning disabilities. So it wasn't a kind of subject matter that I was unfamiliar to me. I think the book taught me all kinds of things that I hadn't realized, I think. it was drawn to my attention by the producers of the film, two of the producers of the film, Stevie Lee and Jeremy Dear, whose son Joss is in the film as a young autistic boy, 12 years old. And I think when they found the book, they found it kind of revelatory in the way they understood their son. And they started discussions with my producer, Al Morrow. And then I came on to and got involved in the film and thought about doing it in this way that used the text of the book with different people around the world. Now, I kind of wanted to make it global because I sort of feel those representations of non-speaking autistic people are so often kind of in the West and North, and autism is everywhere and manifests itself in different ways according to the cultures people are living in.
The film combines quite a number of elements. It has stories of those characters, those personalities, those people that you mentioned. There's monologue from the book. There's your audio and visual representations of the experiences of people with autism. And you kind of have a proxy protagonist, I suppose, in the young boy that sort of becomes the protagonist of the film. And then David Mitchell as well, the author. So you had quite a number of elements in the film. How did you figure out that they would be your elements and then start to think about how you would combine them?
I think it was one of the most sort of improvisatory films that I've made, in the sense of usually when I think about a film in the early stages, I'm thinking of a sort of shape, a rough kind of shape. Where are the intense moments? Where's the contemplative material? Where are the crisis moments? And obviously, usually you have a story. In this case, the book is a set of 58 questions and answers. So it's kind of an unpromising start in some ways. There's no characters, there's no plot. But I think one sort of big dilemma in the edit was, should you do that conventional thing in a multi-character documentary where you intercut between the people and, you leave each one on a cliffhanger and then you go to the next. And that felt really inappropriate. It felt like what we wanted to do was immerse people in the detail of people's lives, and that needed time, and you needed time with each character in the film. So that structure of being with one person for 15 minutes and then being with another person for 15 minutes, and you take your experience of the first person into your experience of the second person, and that starts to develop an understanding of the things those people have in common. That was the kind of structure that we went to. And then I really wanted to avoid the idea of these people being case studies or being like examples of the words in the book. So that had kind of two implications. I think first, to try and find a space for the book that wasn't the documentary contributors space, which was where we came up with this idea of a sort of journey, very loosely, a journey through a landscape of this young non-speaking Japanese British lad, Jim Fujiwara, who we kind of shot with in different locations as he kind of journeys from the sea to the city. And that has its origins actually in a story Naoki wrote about being kind of free of his body and sort of floating through the world. So that, and then I think the kind of non-autistic people in the film, who are generally parents, I wanted to avoid that kind of trope of the non-speaking autistic film where it's all told through the experience, through the dramatic emotional experience of the parent. So I think they're kind of there to give some context, which we might need at times. But as much as possible, we tried to kind of pare back on that as much as we could.
Yeah, it's interesting the way you approach it. You actually told yourself lots of things that you wouldn't do, which then informs what you actually do, because it means you kind of have to take those choices of what you want to avoid, and then that hones what you actually want to do.
Yeah, I think Walter Murch said the director is the film's immune system, and I think that's a really valuable thing, that your job in a way is to filter things out rather than to kind of create them, especially in documentary where it's an engagement with the world, and what you're doing is kind of selecting and filtering reality into this thing which somehow represents it, or represents your experience of encountering that reality. So I guess you start a filmmaking process where you're building up a set of rules, and I tend to be far too expansive in that phase, where I'll allow all kinds of stuff in, and probably the films that I make generally, they have lots of characters and they go into lots of places. So I struggle a bit with that thing of like narrowing it down and being more minimal. But I think in this case, it's like if you had we had sort of, I think, kind of rules about the way we shot things. We knew that we didn't want to use lots of special effects. We wanted to pull a different way of seeing just from the everyday lives of the people we were with. So to shoot in those environments and record sound in those environments, but to do it in a way that took off from Naoki's words in the book. One of the things that Naoki says is that for him, he often gets immersed in the detail of things, in the patterns or the shapes or the flow of a detail, to the exclusion of all else, to the exclusion of the overall context. And so that was an idea that we took into the shooting, shooting with macro lenses where you'll encounter a situation or an object just through a detail of it before you kind of reveal what that detail is.
Another aspect of that to me felt like there's great texture in the film. That whether it's in the macro shots or it's in the wider shots, is that in not using special effects, you're kind of committing to finding the right cinematic language to go with his words. And in my mind, I feel like that would take a tremendous amount of planning and location research and all those kinds of things. How did you kind of approach those aspects?
I think it's probably back to that set of rules. I think I don't know, Ruben and I had to write something about cinematography in the film a while back, and I think we kind of realised really that there were three approaches. One was this, it was a documentary approach that was relatively kind of stepped back and wide frame and kind of allowed a lot of kind of negative space and around people and a bit of distance. Combine that with a very subjective approach to shooting spaces. So a lot of detail. Often we'd shoot that at the end of the day. We'd just so for example, we'd spend a day with Amrit in 40-degree heat in Noida on the edges of Delhi in the high-rise block, and she's got 4 different fans kind of turning and creating this kind of vibration in the air, and then making this sort of rattly sound, and it feels like if you kind of get into it, the room is kind of vibrating, pulsating, and then I suppose you start to think, okay, how can we convey that pulsation of the room, which it feels like Amrit kind of enjoys, and Amrit would sit and kind of rock in front of the fan in a way that felt like she enjoyed the flow of air and the rhythms that it created. So then it's about, let's shoot for that. So not so much planning, I think we might have noticed the day before that there were a lot of fans in the room, and that they had and got this feeling from them. But it's more being attentive to kind of how the space feels, and we knew that was a key way of shooting it. And then I suppose the third element was the element with the young boy, which we wanted to be much more kinetic and much more, have a lot more movement to it. So we shot all that with a Movi sort of Steadicam type device, which allowed us to kind of, be and follow Jim through these landscapes.
In terms of the people that you chose to be in the film, as you mentioned, they're very much an international collection of people. How did you go about finding those people, knowing that you've got, some in the United States, some in the UK, in India, in Africa, if I'm not mistaken? It's a little while since I saw the film, actually. It's very much an international group of people. How did you approach finding them?
I mean, I think there were lots of, the choices of people was endless, I guess. I suppose I'm not really a great believer in like casting a documentary. I sort of feel it's what's much more important is the relationship between the filmmaker and the person being filmed, and how that kind of manifests itself on screen, and how do you build that relationship. But I suppose for this, when I saw Amrit's work, she's a 21-year-old artist who started drawing at the age of 4 or 5 as a way of communicating her day to her mum. And that drawing, that communication has turned into this incredible artwork, very vibrant, of colour and full of detail, that has a very distinctive way of looking at the world. And it felt to me that was the place to start. If what we wanted to do, first of all, like the book does, is take you into this world of sort of dizzying detail and intensity, that to do that through a visual artist was a good place to start. So it's hence the choice of Amrit. Then, the film ends with Justina in Sierra Leone, and I knew that the film kind of wanted to have this progressive kind of opening out, maybe from an internal, quite kind of subjective sensory experience into one that thought about society and society's response to autism and how that shaped what autism is and how it's experienced. And I'd been filming in Sierra Leone and was kind of interested in autism in a Sierra Leonean context, and came across this amazing work from Mary Pentimity, who does this work with, particularly in rural areas, Mary's the mother of Justina, and became aware, I think, of the stigma associated with autism and the association of autism with autistic children being children of devils, and which is a strongly held belief and results in autistic children being abandoned quite frequently, and particularly in the kind of rural areas. And Mary's been doing this work with parents and communities, just essentially education, awareness raising. So that felt like an interesting place to look at how we have to kind of grapple with the way society views non-speaking autistic people, not just stay within the experience of it. And I tried in the film to make it clear that this wasn't like an African problem. This is something that all of our societies do to a greater or lesser extent. In Europe 75 years ago, autistic people were being gassed in vans in Germany. It's a dark, when I started working with autistic people, there were long stay hospitals were essentially kind of dumping grounds for people. So it's a very dark history that we're emerging from, and it felt like it was important to speak about that as well.
You mentioned the edit, and in a lot of cases you're answering my questions before I can get to them. But now I will ask you, there's always moments in the edit where you are bringing all these elements together and you reach a problem or you reach a challenge that you have to overcome. Was there any such time in your edit where you had something to figure out, and what was the result of that?
Yeah, I mean, I think the idea of the film almost being in sections, where you spent a lot of time with each person and then moved to the next and left the first person behind, was something we came to a bit later in the edit. To begin with, I think we were trying to do that thing of intercutting scenes with different people, and it felt like quite a bold move to move away from that. I think I'd seen Camera Person, which has that structure of very kind of you're with someone and then you're somewhere else completely, and it's very much like the film is in parts. And I loved that structure in Camera Person, and I felt like it could work for this, because ultimately you were still building up one shape. It wasn't like you were making 4 separate films about different groups of people. They all combine into a whole. So I think that was one sort of challenge, and that was a big negotiation with all the stakeholders in the film, I guess, as well, who were worried, will it be like 4 different films, 4 short films? This is not what we funded, that sort of stuff. But ultimately people were on board for it, and that was great. But I mean, another really difficult decision was I'd filmed with a fifth person, or a 6th person actually, because there are 2 people together in the States, a young lad in Glasgow, and he'd been in a theatre production based on The Reason I Jump, and I thought there was something really nicely kind of interesting about moving between this performance of the book and the book itself. And Corey himself is a fascinating young man who was really into space and science, and kind of but performing was a huge step for him. And that was it sort of didn't work in the edit, not because of anything we'd shot or because of it wasn't interesting or anything like that, but because structurally the idea of the play knocked against the idea of the book. I think you can kind of only have one overarching organizing structure for things, and this was like 2 overarching, which were going to compete with each other. Hang on, is this a book? Is this a play? What is it? So in the end, we cut that, which was a radical, ruthless decision, difficult decision. But I think we sort of made it in time, and hopefully we'll do other things with that material.
If I could ask you a little bit more about the visual makeup of the film, I personally always find it great that if at a point in the edit you can sort of look at your film and say, okay, I see what I have created here in terms of the structure of the story, and that informs maybe some new shooting that I will do to create more of a visual landscape for it. Did you do that in this film, or was everything kind of on location, or did you go out afterwards and go, okay, like we've edited a certain amount, I now know what I need to shoot for this?
No, I mean, everything was pretty much shot on location, but we did schedule a sort of second visit to Amrit, which was during the edit, which was kind of always in the schedule. And that's when I think in the film you see her exhibition coming to fruition. And then there were some things. So, for example, we shoot with David Mitchell, who's the translator of the book, who really is the person who tells you what the book is, which felt like an important thing to do in the film. And there's a moment, I think, where we're using an extract from the book that's about rain, and we shot some material of kind of water falling on the pages of the book, so that was definitely something we did kind of late on in my kitchen. But I think mostly, I hope I'm not misremembering it, but mostly it was kind of, shot at the time. And I guess we ended up, as you always do, there were a number of sequences that never made it. We spent a day with Ben, who's part of a rowing club, rowing on the kind of river by Washington DC, which again, was it's when two scenes have the same function, isn't it? It's like a scene can really only have one function, and if there are then two scenes that have the same function, that's where you kind of need to make the ruthless decision. And I think, sometimes there were scenes that took you into a kind of particular sensory experience, which were really kind of repeats of other scenes, even though they were in a completely different context.
And then you obviously have an incredible soundscape, and that's such a huge part of this film. And it's, I think on the link that I saw, it actually said, put on your headphones, or maybe that was in the email that came with it, because this is really a 360 kind of soundscape. A lot of the time in documentary, sound can almost be an afterthought of sorts, but obviously it's incredibly central to this. Was that something new for you to approach it in that way? And how did you go about that?
A little bit new, yeah. I knew that I wanted to work with Nick Ryan, who's a sound artist who's done a lot of work around the kind of neuroscience of hearing and of listening, and who is synesthetic himself, and synesthesia is very common in non-speaking autistic people. So I felt he could bring some of his kind of personal experience to the structure of this sound track. We knew from Naoki's book and from other writings by non-speaking autistics that sound was incredibly important, and the intensity of sound was incredibly important to their daily experience. And Nick said, well, let's make the film in 360, which I had no idea what that meant or involved, but sounded like a good idea. So I said yes, and that kind of, we then tried to do something which I think was probably quite unusual, mainly through our naivety, which is that our sound recorder, Sarah Lima, basically recorded 360 sound in all of our observational locations. So we would have one recorder on the camera getting the kind of positional 360. She'd have a kind of Ambio 360 mic, which was recording the ambience of room spaces and things like that. And then she'd have a MS mic, a double MS on the boom, which also can give you a sort of surround feel. So when it came to the mix, we were kind of rooting it in these real 360, not kind of atmoses which were recorded separately, but the real 360 atmospheres of the spaces that we were in. And in a Dolby Atmos mix, you can position a sound in, I think, 128 different places in a cinema. So you're kind of thinking quite carefully how sounds are moving, where they're appearing. And there's a trick I think we learned to it, which is, you can't do that all the time, that people become immune to it. So you have to do it in kind of key moments of the film. There are these points where the sound becomes very, very sort of 360. And we then did a binaural mix, which is why you were told to listen on the headphones, which basically kind of splits the stereo wide and gives us sort of 360 feel inside the headphones. But it's nothing like experiencing the film in a Dolby Atmos cinema, which I hope people can do coming up soon.
So take me through that then. So when you go to the sound mix, sound edit, is that when you're making those decisions, you're sitting in a room and you're experiencing that scene by scene and trying to figure it out as you go?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think, we start out with the 16 tracks of audio that Sarah's recorded on location. Nick's then designing and augmenting that and which tracks are used in a sound design track lay, essentially. And in doing that, Nick would do things like there's a sequence about rain in the film, which comes from a piece of writing Naoki does about how when he hears the sound of rain, he has to run through his mental images of memories of rain in order to associate the sound of rain with the idea that it is now raining. So Nick kind of in that sequence, which we happened to shoot Amrit during a thunderstorm, and Nick sort of then layers into that sounds which are resonant of rain, as though they're kind of memories of rain, but aren't necessarily rain, like the sound of paper crinkling or of the tapping on a piece of metal, or different sounds which are feel more like associations or memories and give the audience hopefully an idea that this is kind of rain, but it's like rain in the past, or it's rain remembered, or it's and then going into the mix, we're then working with Ben Baird, who from Aquarium, who did the mix. Thinking about more specifically about the positioning of those sounds and whether or how they kind of move and how they combine with each other.
Wow. I mean, taking a little bit of a step back, because you mentioned it earlier, the stakeholders, and having to change your approach and then maybe run that past people. Can you tell me a little bit about the background of putting this film together as something maybe a little bit different to what you'd done before, saying to potential partners, funders, that this is about people who are non-verbal, and, the immediate thought people might have is, well, how are you going to do that? And then convincing them of your approach. I know it's probably a long time ago and a little bit boring for you at this stage, but it would be interesting to hear how you approach that.
So the main financiers on the film were Vulcan Productions in the States and the BFI. And they were both kind of hugely supportive of the film and of the idea. I think the BFI brought that desire for it to be cinema, not just to be a TV doc, but to be something that worked in the cinema. And obviously, because the book is a sensory, above all, a sort of sensory description of experience, it felt potentially very cinematic. And Vulcan brought a desire that the film would also have impact, would sort of, bring about some changes in the ways people perceive non-speaking autistic people, bring about some, more fulfilling lives for non-speaking autistic people. So it's like you're bringing those two desires together. And sometimes, the film feels too cinematic for the people that want impact, and too impactful or too campaigny for those that want it to be cinematic. And I think, in the end, you are trying to create an experience, like a 90 minute experience for people in a cinema. That's what's in my head when I'm making the film. But you're also aware that it needs to, it needs not to fall into the tropes of autism representation. It needs to show, for example, it needs to show the diversity of this community. It needs not to stereotype non-speaking autism in a certain way. So you're aware of those issues of representation, I think, whilst you're doing it. And then it's I generally, in the making of a film, I show people a lot of stuff. I show people scenes, and probably by the time they see them in the film, they're so familiar they can no longer judge them. And you just hope that it's it'll get through. But I think there were times where I think the very first cut, someone said, what you've made is an art film, and that's not what we want. And then at times it's like things are too far the other way. So it's kind of just calibrating the film. And you hope, obviously it always, I think, to make a good film, you have to not only do the filmmaking well, but you have to have the conditions to make a good film, and those conditions are about, who's funding it, what's the nature of their interventions, Are they helpful? Are they unhelpful? Are they, and how can we make this a collaboration in which we're all heading in the same direction? And I feel on this film particularly, for me, it did feel like that was given an enormous amount of freedom and trust to make it, the subject matter of the film kind of drove us outside the conventional talking heads doc anyway. That would have been a really kind of poor response to the material, I think. So yeah, it was a lot of fun, and I think I learned a lot about filmmaking.
To me, it sounds incredibly dangerous to show people so many scenes along the way, and not because feedback isn't welcome and always helpful, but maybe that you'd worry that people tire of particular scenes, and I often say to people, if they start to feel a particular scene isn't working, is to remind themselves how they felt about that scene the first time they watched it, because most people who see your film will only see it once.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, I think, and there's some people obviously you want to hold back for late in the process when they'll see it for that first time. It can work both ways, It can be that something that troubled them the first time, by the time they've seen it sort of reworked 6 times, they'll just go, yeah, that's great. I love that moment when that thing happens, which probably no one watching the film for a single time would notice. I don't know. I mean, I think it certainly. I don't mind show. I think it's a different showing, like an early whole cut of something. I'm really resistant to doing that with people, than showing individual scenes which are sort of out of context, and you're really you're kind of giving a taste of something. Whereas obviously when you sit down and watch a hour and a half, 2 hour perhaps rough cut, it's got to be in as advanced a stage possible, because it's only really at the point at which it's all kind of singing and dancing that you really understand what it's going to become.
You mentioned making a film for the cinema, but also making a film that has an advocacy element. I don't really see those things as being mutually exclusive in this case, and that the more cinematic this film becomes, the more engrossed you are, the more you care, and the more you want to tell people to see this film, not just because of the subject material, but also because it's a wonderful film in and of itself. But now that it's being released, it feels like there's a lot at stake in my mind, in that you really want people to see this film, and you really want them to think about people with autism and their own attitudes, and maybe how we can rethink some of those. What are your hopes for what it can do, and how has that been going so far?
I mean, as the film gets released, I think it's important. Like we have a sort of plan for releasing it, which tries to involve autistic people in the release as much as possible, in Q&As, in through work packs that are produced. We've produced a couple of resource packs around the film, which are written by autistic people, with organizations. So to try and use, I suppose, I mean, I think you always try and do this in documentaries, to use that moment when the kind of light is shone on an issue or a group for a moment, for that moment of the release. It's an incredibly powerful moment. A lot of words will get spoken in those few weeks, and there's the potential to do things which otherwise can't rise above the noise. So I think it's that pressure. Like, how do you, what is it that we would see as a kind of productive result of this film, and how can we kind of nudge that into existence? I think those are the things. And as a filmmaker, I think you can't do that on your own. You don't know that world as well as other people know it. You're in the hands really more of how do we use this? How do you want to use this film to the communities whose experiences it addresses? Because
it's a completely different job to making a film is getting it out as well as it can be. I mean, how big a role do you try to play in that? Because I think a director can bring a lot to that as well, because you are the maker of the film. People will want to listen to you. People will want to interview you. So it kind of gives you a dual purpose in that respect.
Yeah, I mean, I do get pretty involved in that stage. I guess it's that you're continuing to be that kind of immune system thing, aren't you? Like, let's do with this film what its intention is, and but I think that it's essential that is also, perhaps the non-film work part of it is led by people that are better able to do that and more involved than you are, and who can sustain it over the long term. I mean, a long time ago, 2008, made a film called Heavy Load, which is about a punk band in which included people with learning disabilities. And one of the things that came out of that film was this. It's a theme in the film, but it came out in the film as a sort of campaign, almost we call the Stay Up Late campaign, which was about the fact that for a lot of people in care homes, in group homes, they had fewer opportunities for a social life, particularly in the evenings, just because of the way their staff rotas changed. So because this film was about a band, they would find that when they were playing predominantly disabled audience venues, the audience would disperse and disappear at 8 o'clock, and not because the audience didn't like their music or didn't want to be there, but because their support workers' rota's time was going to finish at 8:30 and they had to be home for the change, and that resulted in a change in the way homes are assessed. We've got in some local authorities assessment that includes the quality of people's social life, not just about whether people eat well or are able to do other kinds of activities during the day. It's created this thing called Gig Buddies, which pairs people with learning disabilities to go to gigs, and that's now global. It's in Sydney and New York, and so but none of that work would have been possible if the band themselves that were at the center of the film didn't take up that and pursue it and turn it into an organization, which then got charitable status, which then kind of got funding, and now there's 5 workers in an organization that are kind of powering that, and it's 12 years later and it's still going, and now is something very different from the film. It's its own thing.
It's funny you mentioned Heavy Load. I mean, you have such a diverse filmography at this stage, and I think of films like Deep Water, Town of Runners, Don't Run Known, How to Change the World. They're all quite different, or maybe we could put them into a couple of different categories of approaches: observational filmmaking versus kind of like more retrospective interview-led filmmaking. But is there a commonality to how you choose the subjects that you want to follow, and also how you then approach a story in terms of going, well, I have this not necessarily set of rules, but I approach these films in a certain way to find the story that appeals to me, that I want to tell.
I mean, I think it's back to that thing of a sense of what the shape of the film is. That's one thing. Like if first sort of ideas for subject matter. I mean, you have ideas aren't a problem, are they? You have tons of ideas all the time, but it's like getting the idea to the stage where it both sort of seems something worthwhile to devote a few years to. And something that there is an audience for. But so for me, that stage of realizing, okay, so if I'm doing a film in an Ethiopian village, it's about these 2 young girls, then maybe the film has this shape. Maybe they'll succeed, maybe they'll fail. I don't want to hinge the whole film on whether they succeed or not. So it's not about that. It's about what the role is in their culture, and then it's about them as adolescents growing up and leaving home. And it's also about the country in a stage of transition. So you start to get these kind of layers and themes, and there might be a layer that's very intimate and personal, or even subjective. It might be a layer of the film that's only going on in one person's head, that you're shooting with, and they may not even be aware of it, but you might have sort of seen it maybe. And then there's a kind of layer that's more interpersonal, their relationships with others around them, and then there's the wider, bigger themes. And it feels to me, it's important to make films that speak to the times, that have something to say about now. So even if you're doing, like at the moment, I'm doing a film about based on 300 hours of tape recordings from a house that was haunted by a poltergeist. Now, which in some ways is like, oh, why at this moment are you doing a film about a poltergeist? But I think you start to look in that, you bring the times to it, don't you? And you say, well, actually, this is also about perception and truth, and about the way people are constructing reality, and those themes start to creep in. So I think for me, it's like, has it got a shape? Can you see it? Are there things you can actually film? It's difficult with a poltergeist. Does it speak to the times? Is it something that I think I've got to take on? Like, it's also your own personal relationship to it, isn't it? It has to be something personal, even if that personal side is very buried within the film.
To talk a little bit about where you are now with this particular film, you're in the distribution phase. As I said, I've mentioned many of your films there. Actually, as I look at you now, I see Sour Grapes over your shoulder, so that's another one. But I think probably in the years that you've been making films over the last 15 or so years or more, the landscape of how documentaries are consumed, for want of a better word, the places that they end up has changed a lot. Can you think a little bit about what you've learned about what happens to your films when they're finished? And maybe in a way to think of someone that's making their first film now and is about to take it out into the world. What have you learned about what happens to your films when they're finished?
I mean, I think I sort of came to making films relatively late. I think I did Deep Water was when I was in my early 40s. And prior to that, I'd done shorter films, but mostly kind of worked as a community artist for 15 years. And I think I've become quite wedded to a certain form, the form of the feature doc, which is a certain thing in itself, and it's a 90-minute experience. It can be very layered. It doesn't have to be, information-led, voice-led. It doesn't have to be, a thesis, although it can be. And I don't know what the future of that form is. In some ways, it feels like, with Deep Water, that was at the moment just after Touching the Void, when I think certainly the commercial world of film suddenly realized that documentary features were sort of possible again, and had an audience, and that was a very exciting time. And on the back of that, lots of documentary features got made, and then kind of went into a phase where there were slots for documentary features on television, and you wouldn't be able to get the money for a film just from one country, but you could make an international co-production and kind of sell it across different European channels, and those slots have now pretty much gone, So I don't know where that form stands. I sense that it's still, people are still making those films, making feature docs. There's an incredible wealth, perhaps because the equipment's become so much more accessible. There's an incredible amount of production happening. Whether those films can find their audience, I sense that there's this kind of cycle that happens where things progressively become more formatted. The more successful a form is, the more it starts as single feature docs, and then people go, well, maybe we could make a series, because then we can just put the same amount of marketing into like 8 hours of stuff instead of like an hour and a half. And then the next stage is, well, maybe we could make this like a format, because then instead of just selling the kind of 8 hours of stuff, we can sell that format to 200 countries, and then I feel like the audience hits a point where it's like, this has got so far from what I want from documentary, from factual, which is to bring me a take on the world that's out there. It's so structured and formatted that then there's a re-embracing of feature docs, and I think at the moment we're in the sort of series tipping into formats moment of that cycle, and that we might have to wait another 5 years before suddenly feature docs are the kind of thing of the moment again.
I ask everyone what advice they would give to young people entering the industry, and it is a tough one to make a living in. As you say, you came to it a little bit late. You've been doing it for quite a number of years. What would you say to yourself if you were starting now, I suppose?
I don't know. I mean, I didn't go to film school, and I sort of feel like it's more important to kind of have to study something to make films about rather than to study filmmaking. I don't feel like the skills of filmmaking, the technology changes every 6 months, so whatever you've learned on one thing is kind of redundant and needs to be replaced. B, I think you learn it by doing it, and it's a kind of lifelong project. So I would say, I think kind of, obviously the obvious thing is to get out and make things, but I think also to bring yourself to it. I think that's a hard thing to learn. There's a great quote by the dancer, choreographer Martha Graham, who says, it's not your, I paraphrase it, but she says it's not your job to judge what you do or whether it's good enough. Your job is to make it completely your own, completely of you. And I think that's kind of in a way all we can do. And because we're kind of human, I think an audience will, whatever's of you is also of other people. And it's all of the kind of stuff we put in between that stops us from doing that ends up with kind of not so great films, or films that don't respect an audience, or treat them as kind of as too stupid to understand stuff, or whatever. That making it of you is the crucial thing.
Thanks, man, Jerry. I really appreciate the time that you've given me today. Like it's an amazing film, The Reason I Jump, and I really hope people will go and see it in vast numbers. But listen, thanks a million for taking the time, and best of luck. Really appreciate it.
Great, thanks.
Thanks again to Jerry for taking part in the interview. The Reason I Jump is now widely available in the UK and Ireland in now open cinemas. Thanks to Stephen Galvin and Film Ireland for supporting the podcast, and to film composer Michael Fleming for kindly allowing me to steal his music. You can find more of it at michaelflemingmusic.com. And thanks to you for listening.